Welcome. I'm Nancy Spannaus, and this class is devoted to the question of informing ourselves in much more depth than we ever were taught in school, and in the depth that we need to be about the American Revolution. This is in part because that anniversary is coming up. And it's also in part because the American Revolution is actually controversial at the present time. The attention to it tends to follow the split politically in the country, which is generally thought of as, right versus left, but don't think of it that way. Think of it as whether people think that that revolution was a idealistic, wonderful accomplishment, never to be rivaled anywhere else, versus that's one extreme, and the other extreme being it never should have happened because of all the horrible things that occurred in our history. So we're going to take a different approach and dive into the actual developments in the course of the building of the revolution and its success. So let me just start. We're going to do, as Lynn said, 4 classes. This will be on the causes, and we'll have a lot of information in this class. And if you really want the slides, just contact Lynn, or I'll put out my email in the chat and ask me, and I'm perfectly willing to send you the slides. So the second will really get into the more controversial areas of how revolutionary was this revolution, something that has been challenged strongly in the recent period and in other periods as well. The third will do Alexander Hamilton, and then we'll do sort of a tour of the history of our country and where we stand relative to those founding principles. As I said, it's in general informed by my 2 books. Defeating Slavery came out in November, and Hamilton versus Wall Street, which is a more general survey of Hamilton, well, starting in depth in Hamilton's Report on Manufactures and going through its influence over the course of the history of our country and numerous others as well. So on the American Revolution, we have to clarify some terms here, and that was something we should be thinking about all the way through the class. This is John Adams, and he wanted to make it very clear to people that in his view, the revolution was not the war. I mean, I agree with that, and that will be emphasized throughout. The revolution was a revolution in people's thinking and minds, and in his view, that occurred before a shot was fired. It occurred by 1775. And there are others who disagree with that. And I think I leave it to you in part to grapple with that question as we go through the history of what actually proceeded. But we'll be we'll be paying a lot of attention to what was going on in the minds of the people in that period coming up to 1775, actually coming up to the Declaration itself, which is where this first class will conclude. So just to give you something of a sense of the shape of this, one of the major shifting points is the 7 Years' War. The war, which was actually a world war between the British Empire and its allies and the French Empire and in other anti-British forces in the world. So that'll that will be a focus of attention. And we will pay a lot of attention to, as I promised in the promo for this, to the documents and writings that were being read extensively throughout all the 13 colonies. That these pamphlets, not just common sense, which is what all of us were told about in our very cursory history books, but many other pamphlets and writings. These people were voluminous writers and readers as well. And we'll learn a lot, I think, of some of the thinking that went into the revolution in that way. And it should be noted, and this should become clear as we go through the history, that a lot of the impetus came from Massachusetts. Now, you're all familiar. We just passed the Boston Tea Party 250th anniversary. I'm sure numerous of you paid some attention to that. And that was, Boston was the big troublemaker in many people's view that actually precipitated things. But there's a deeper view. Of course, John Adams, who made the statement that I opened with, was also from Massachusetts. This was a leading intellectual input to the revolution itself. So I'm going to proceed with this in 4 different sections on the causes of the revolution. As you see right there. So the simmering conflict. From the beginning, you have to take a look at the different colonies and what their relationship was to Great Britain. They obviously, the forms of government and the founding were quite different from one place to the other. But one of the actual common elements of the whole operation was that for a long period of time, the initial colonies chartered by the king were actually effectively governing themselves. Yes, indeed, the crown had an ultimate power, but they were chartered, and in many cases, those charters actually gave them the rights to legislate for themselves in the way that the British Parliament legislated for England and the empire as a whole. They were given the authority by the crown in the charter that they would impose their own taxes, that they would run their own affairs. Their lower houses would be effectively their houses of commons. One of the leading examples of those charters, and the most Republican in the small r of all of them, was Massachusetts. And this Massachusetts Body of Liberties, which was, you see in the previous one, 1641, reflected the most, I would say, advanced, but most Republican of those charters. They were committed to writing down the laws that were necessary, providing easy access to the courts. That was very important, even for enslaved people. Self-government, as long as the laws were not in conflict with the English law. And then they did things that the English law did not. They mitigated criminal penalties, ended primogeniture in terms of transmission of property, and gave much more humane treatment to debtors than was happening in England. So this is in the middle of the 17th century. And the Connecticut was formed from Massachusetts, as you may very well know. And they had a similar kind of charter. Many people consider that the first written constitution of the Americas. And their ideas might a little bit surprise you. I mean, the foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people, they said, when they voted on this Constitution. The General Court, elected by the freemen, had the power to determine the laws. And interestingly enough, there's no reference at all to the king in this charter of 1639. Now, these are considering the time frame there, we're dealing with pre-English Civil War. The English Civil War, when it broke out between 1642 and 1649, had an enormous effect on what was going on in the colonies. The Massachusetts and New England Puritans and leaders tended to be aligned with the opposition to the anti-monarchical forces. Later on, we see that some of the southern colonies were much more aligned with the Restoration after the Civil War was concluded. One of the leading influences that came over here, Republican writing, was those of John Milton, pushing for the right of the people to go so far as to depose a king if he is not basically acting for the good of the people. So that was circulated here. Now, with the Restoration, which happens not all that long after the Civil War, after the death of Cromwell, there is a crackdown on the colonies, particularly in New England. They set up, this is elaborated in a book by Graham Lowry, which you can also get. And they demand that the charter, which gave these New England colonies all this power for self-government, be returned. It's no longer valid. The king's in charge now. Massachusetts gives its charter back. Connecticut figures out a way never to give its charter back. So they remain a charter colony all the way through to the Revolution. Even New York. Now, New York is a different kind of founding, right? It was founded by the Dutch. It was transferred from the Dutch to the British in 1664, and was pretty much a crown colony from the beginning, with under the brother of the king. But even that basic charter guarantees due process of law, jury trials by one's peers, freedom from a standing army. I mean, these are things that you identify with us as a revolutionary country against Great Britain, but they were part of what was actually a strain of English law that was implemented in the colonies much earlier. Now, you had another kind of colony, not a charter, not given a charter by the king, but handed over by the king to certain proprietors, and the key examples being Lord Baltimore and William Penn. And that happens for various reasons under the restoration of the monarchy. And in those cases, it's not the people of the colony determining what their rights should be. It's whatever the proprietor actually decides to grant. So that is a different set of orientations. Over time, the 8 of the colonies come directly under the crown. Numerous of the ones who had charters find those charters returned, and the crown is controlling. Connecticut, as I said, saved its charter. Rhode Island did also, and Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland are proprietorships. So they're not directly under the crown. And this is George II, who is very much involved in that kind of shift. But as the situation proceeds in the 18th century, the areas of conflict between the colonies and the government in Great Britain intensify. I mean, these are always have been working there, but there has in general been a lot of leeway in which the colonies could operate. So
Okay.
Whoever's on that, Lynn, you might want to mute. One of the questions is
shit.
currency in Massachusetts.
Oh.
Please mute yourself. Had its own currency. There was a shortage of currency in the colonies due to the nature of
I know.
the laws.
All right, so you're not coming tomorrow or just today? Today you're not coming.
Lynn, could you please mute? I can do it. So this was done by Massachusetts, not as an assertion of independence, but in order to improve their ability to carry out commerce, not only within the colonies and on the mainland, but also in the international overseas. So they had a series, they actually had a whole number of tree currencies, but the pine tree currency was the one that was best known. And this, by the time of the Restoration, or as even before the Restoration, became an annoyance to the British government, thinking that this was too much of a sign of independence and they should be more reliant on when they could get crown hard currency from interchanging with the British. Therefore, in 1684, they declared an end to the currency. Massachusetts went to issuing bills of credit, forms of paper currency, but in the time that we're talking about, the middle of the 18th century, there was a clampdown on that. Too much independence and of the British economic control. So that was extremely significant in terms of a cause of the revolution, causing and intensifying the problems with actual commerce. You also had conflict over manufacturing. As you know, in general, there was a desire on the part of the British motherland that the colonies act as raw material suppliers to the mother country, and they import what's produced there at whatever price the British decide to charge, which obviously put the colonies at a great disadvantage and the motherland at a great profit, as many of the writers later on pointed out. But this gets worse in the middle of the 18th century with a ban on the hat when the British notice that the colonists are taking their relative sense of independence and distance from the motherland to go ahead and produce things themselves, so they don't have to rely on them coming from overseas, hats, various finished iron products and so forth. And therefore you get these acts, the Hat Act and the Iron Act, both of which are real flashpoints for some sections of the population, building up the conflict. Trade restrictions, of course, were always technically there with the Navigation Act, where the British ruled that all the ships carrying out trade had to be flying the Union Jack. Those could include American ships, but restrictions on and everything that, for example, we would want to export to France would have to go to Britain first and then to France, or, from France, it goes France to Britain and then over here. So, which allowed various taxation and other problems. So this was also a source. This got worse in 1864 with the Sugar Act, which put new restrictions on trade with the Caribbean. And that was another sore point that began to create more animosity. And then even the slave trade, very early on, even though many merchants and planters were willingly participated in the trade. In fact, in late 17th century, the British decided they should end their monopoly on the African slave trade and cut in the people who lived in the colonies, in the American colonies. But there were early attempts, in particularly the example I reference is Pennsylvania, to try to ban the import of new slaves into the colonies, to try to tax the trade so severely that it would be wiped out of existence. And these were vetoed by the Crown each time they were carried out. There was also conflict over freedom of the press. This is the Zenger trial of 1735, many, many years ago. Wrote about this in the, the British law applied in the colonies as it did in the island, that if you libeled a public official, if you told a bad story about a public official, that was libel per se. It didn't matter whether it was true or not. You were undermining the authority of the authorities. So this was what happened to this printer, Peter Zenger, and the Americans revolted against that. A particular jury in New York decided that they were going to ignore the technicalities of the law and acquit Peter Zenger. That did not stick as a precedent for many, many decades, but it was a source clearly of conflict between the concept of what freedom actually was and how it would be implemented here. You did have, what we've been dealing with so far is all independent colonies looked at almost as their own different countries, although with common allegiance to the king in Great Britain. There was one attempt at unity between the colonies in 1754. This was not done as an independence move, as far as I can tell, although I used to think so, but it definitely played a role in beginning to pull some of these colonies together and looking at themselves as in a common interest. Now, the 7 Years' War change is dramatic. First, the Americans have gained war experience. They get a sense of themselves working together and effectively against the French and the Indians and their allies, the Indians. But they also come right up against, with the British Army here, a new conflict, area of conflict with the British themselves. They're seen, this is Lord Loudon. I happen to live in Loudoun County, unfortunately. And he was head of the army, and he just basically had total disdain for these Americans who seemed to be unable to be disciplined. George Washington was one of the people he came into conflict with, and who in general, found the idea reinforced that the British did not consider the Americans an actual, to have the rights of English, what they called the rights of Englishmen. They saw them as second-class citizens. The ascendance of George III to the throne comes in the middle of that 7 Years' War. And in part, I'm told, informed by the reports that came back from the British military in the field about how unruly and outrageous these Americans were, they decide that, look, we've really let these guys have too much leeway, and it's time to assert control. It's time to clamp down on their independent, quasi-independent activity and show who's boss. One of the elements that enforces that is this proclamation line of 1763, which was a royal proclamation saying that that the Americans, part of the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, that no American settlement should happen beyond this line, basically the Appalachian Mountains, unless they had a direct okay from the king, and there was a treaty with the Indians okayed by the king, and so forth and so on. So, of course, there were already thousands of colonists living beyond this line. And this was another major source of conflict because from the very beginning of New England in particular, but also the other colonies who saw their borders extending all the way to the west, I mean, beyond the Mississippi River, they always tended to see themselves as continental, if not a unified continental republic, at least, or continental country, at least a continental state. So what also happens after the 30 years, after the 7 Years' War, is there is a clamp down on American shipping. Americans were considered the quintessential privateers and smugglers of the world. And the attempt was to say, this is taking income and we should clamp down on this. We'll get into this particular incident later, but this is very important because it leads to all kinds of conflict as it is being implemented. It leads to the establishment of vice admiralty courts, which means that the colonists would not, if they were accused of this kind of smuggling, they don't go to a jury of their peers. They go to a court which is run by the British Navy, basically. And they have to go to some far-off place to do it. There were only 2 vice admiralty courts, one in Nova Scotia and the other, I forget where, further in the south, not in New England. But this was a real sign of a red light of danger, of what might happen to them, to many of the colonists. And it led to this famous case of the writs of assistance, which are basically general search warrants that allowed the British to go into a warehouse and say, well, we heard that there were smuggled goods here. We don't have any particulars, but we want to go in there and root around and see what we can find. This was challenged by one of the leading revolutionaries and lawyers in Boston, James Otis, of whom we will hear later, because he didn't strictly stick to this as a particular grievance, but elaborated what the principle involved was. You had the Quartering Act. What happened after the war was over, you'd think the British troops would go home, but no, they sent 10,000 more troops to supposedly guard the border, that proclamation line that I showed you before. And but many of those troops were not on the border. They were in New York City, and there wasn't necessarily enough housing for them controlled by the Crown or the British government. So this act said American colonists had to provide for them. This did not go over well. New Yorkers were very upset about it. So, and then the famous Stamp Act comes, What's interesting about this is that the Stamp Act is usually presented as a revenue measure because of all the money that the British had actually incurred during the course of the war. That was the British argument. You should pay as well, because we did all this to defend you. In fact, during the course of the 7 Years' War, the colonial legislatures did pay money. They paid their troops. They paid for the livelihood of and sustenance of the armies that were involved. It wasn't all what the British did. And the fact is that this tax was going to be used not to go back to England to cut down the debt, but to support the massive troop deployment, which I discussed before, these 10,000 troops, which were basically occupying parts of the colonies. It was a revenue tax for the purpose of an occupation, basically. And that is what really ticked off the Americans. Not that they had to pay a tax, because they were already paying taxes to their local government. In fact, they complained that they weren't the ones that were imposing the tax, but it was the British that were imposing. It was at this time we get the birth of the Sons of Liberty, known for their very, active resistance, sometimes violent resistance, but they included all sorts of people you wouldn't identify with that as well. John Hancock, Benjamin Rush, and Haym Salomon, interestingly enough, known as a financier of the revolution. He was in Philadelphia, I believe, with Robert Morris. And then the new series of taxes after the Stamp Act revolt is successful, which is the declaration that the British can do anything, that impose any tax they want. The Parliament can impose any tax it wants. The Townshend Act's a whole set of new taxes, and then that repealed and a Tea Act. Each tax was smaller than the last, but the principle that the tax was being imposed to raise revenue for British administration of the colonies was the sticking point. Now, I want to go into a bit of the question of what was being discussed and what the arguments were at the time. This is throughout the entire period, starting with that John Adams quote of 1860 in particular to 1875, there was tremendous intellectual ferment. There were at that point a few dozen newspapers. The population here was much more literate than in many places in Europe, and pamphlets galore, right? Some guy in New England would give a sermon and there would be a pamphlet. Somebody else would, write a series of letters, there would be a pamphlet. So there were about 400 between 1750 and 1776, and 3 times that many in the later period. And these were with this fellow Bernard Belin, a historian who really pioneered the work of delving into all this literature to see what was on the minds of the leading revolutionaries at the time. He attributes the various sources of the thinking that was reflected in these pamphlets in all these areas. He doesn't put the Bible first, but I would, because I think it was probably the most widely read and the most widely cited from everything that I have seen. However, you also had the Greek and Roman philosophers. Those who were writing were often, very often, people who had been educated, and they were steeped in the classics. And I'll tell you, it's very surprising to read some of the work of Cicero, for example, and how modern it is in terms of the idea of the rights of the citizen. The so-called Enlightenment. And that is a term that covers all kinds, a wide range of thinking. Basically, it's used today to refer to a bunch of scoundrels who see philosophy as an amoral operation. But and that John Locke would fall into that category. Everything is based upon your own individual self-interest and making a contract to try to keep us from killing each other. But I would say it also includes people of much more solid thought, like Emmerich Vattel, a Swiss jurist who was extremely popular in the thinking of the American revolutionaries, much more so than John Locke. You've got the Puritan revolutionaries, leaders of the Civil War, English Civil War. I mentioned Milton before, but that is extremely important. And the key idea there, which is increasingly widespread, is the fact that there is a natural law above the human authorities. There's not simply what the parliament says, not simply what the king says. There is a natural law that must govern affairs, and we'll get into that a bit more. English common law, that is basically the decisions made by the jurists in England. And this was the leading jurist at the time. And that is cited, all the time in these writings. And then the radical Whigs. These are people who have the most strident views against the monarchy and certain people in the parliament, although they're not anti-monarchists. They're not anti-monarchists. This was really interesting to read some of these letters. This is a whole series published in the papers in England, but they were widely read in the colonies. The context is the South Sea bubble explosion, which caused huge economic distress in England. And the guys who wrote this said that that they have to be punished for the people who did this have to be punished. But the king, was basically misled. And he will only approve laws chosen by common consent. If he governs by his will, instead, he has effectively forfeited the crown. I mean, this is very interesting that this is what was coming out. These are not revolutionaries. These are English Whigs. First principles of power in the people, all the projects of men in power ought to refer to the people solely at their good. And then this is picked up by many American influential pamphleteers. This is Jonathan Mayhew, a Boston Congregationalist. He gave a speech, a sermon, which was widely circulated and published on the anniversary of the execution of Charles I, saying, sure, you can kill a king because he wasn't obeying natural law. He goes after the so-called Christian argument that you have to obey anyone in power because God put them in power if they are your ruler. He said that's not at all what Paul meant. That if the ruler is not doing public good, they're not God's ministers at all. So we have a right to resist. This is 1750. That supports the argument of Mr. Adams. And then Otis, who was in court against the writs of assistance, he takes his arguments in the court and writes a major document called The Rights of the British Colonies, where he elaborates what the basis of actually legitimate law is. His argument says sovereignty is conveyed by the people to those dedicated to the good of the whole, the end of government being the good of mankind. These thinkers very much do something that I wasn't used to, which is to point to the 1688 when William III came in, but they view it as the overthrow of the arbitrary monarchy, the Stuarts, James II, and not only the ascendancy of the parliament, but the ascendancy of certain principles, that the kings can't suspend laws. He can't suspend the parliament. The parliament has to do the spending. No standing army, free elections to parliament, free speech, no excessive bail. I mean, not that this was actually happening, but this was these were the ideas, that the principles that were put out there as what should happen. And Otis is also quite notable, and this is emphasized in my second book, that these laws of nature which provide for these freedoms include all people, all men, black and white. They're all born free. Government must be by stated laws. Laws must be for the good of the people, and no taxes without consent or representation. And, if something goes against that, well, they're not legitimate, and we don't have to respect them. Now, there's another guy who comes to the fore following Otis, and that's John Dickinson. He's a Pennsylvania lawyer, and he's very much agitating about the taxation policy, taxation without consent, because, as I said before, the colonists thought of their own colonial legislatures being like Houses of Commons. They were the ones who were supposed to originate revenue bills. They were the ones who were supposed to mandate the taxes. So, he writes an extensive piece, which is widely circulated. He does it after the Crown has suspended the New York legislature because it wouldn't provide provisions for the British troops. And he basically says, what they're doing is the taxes that they're raising, not only is it illegitimate for them to raise them, but they're raising the taxes on things that they are forbidding us to manufacture. So we're basically under siege. Very, very interesting argument. And in fact, he says the smaller the tax, the more insidious, because it's a statement because the intent is there and they can increase it as much as they want. They're to set a precedent for the independence. Now, he also wrote a song, which is extremely interesting. And if possible, I'd like to play it. I don't know whether you can hear it. He got this published all over the colonies in the newspapers. And look at it, it just undercuts this whole anti-taxation idea. Join band in hand, rouse, note, we won't go with tyrannous acts. In freedom we're born, in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready, steady, friends, steady. Not as slaves, but as free men, our money will give. So we'll pay taxes, but we'll pay taxes when we determine what those taxes should be. So let me see if somebody should unmute so they can tell me whether you hear this or not.
5 words you pronounce wrong. 2 years before your brain starts shut.
No, 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 no.
I heard it.
Okay, you heard it. Let me see if I
We
can.
heard it, Nancy. I think that was just an ad that probably comes.
Yeah,
Dementia
okay.
is now known as type 3 diabetes, according to the Mayo.
Okay, here you go. This is done to the Song of the British Navy.
Come join hand in hand, brave Americans all, and rouse your bold hearts at fair liberty's call. No tyrannous act shall suppress your just claim, or stain with dishonor America's name. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady, not as slaves, but as free men our money will give. Our worthy forefathers, let's give them a cheer. To climates unknown did courageously steer. Through oceans to deserts for freedom they came, and dying bequeathed us their freedom and fame. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady, not as slaves, but as free men our money will give. How sweet are the labors that free men endure, that they shall enjoy all the profits secure. No more such sweet labors Americans know, if Britons shall reap what Americans sow. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady, not as slaves, but as free men our money will give. Then join hand in hand, brave Americans all. By uniting we stand, by dividing we fall. In so righteous a cause let us hope to succeed, for heaven approves of each generous deed. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady, not as slaves, but as free men our money will give. All ages shall speak with amaze and applause of the courage we'll show in support of our laws. To die we can bear, but to serve we disdain, for shame is to freemen more dreadful than pain. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady, not as slaves, but as free men our money will give. This bumper I crown for our sovereign's health, and this for Britannia's glory and wealth. That wealth and that glory immortal may be, if she is but just and we are but free. In freedom we're born, and in freedom we'll live. Our purses are ready. Steady, friends, steady, not as slaves, but as free men our money will give.
Okay, so shortly after that, British troops sent to Boston because they're not abiding by they're being objecting to the Townsend taxes. Then you have a major event that I referenced before of this, when the British are trying to enforce their so-called anti-smuggling law. This is in Rhode Island. one of the British schooners gets burned by a number of Rhode Island citizens. And this is important because the British respond to this by saying, okay, you know, forget the idea of us trying to enforce law in these colonies. If we find you and arrest you, you're coming to Britain to be tried. So this is a huge red flag. It leads to the establishment of the Committees of Correspondence, which is very important for national unity. Note that in that song, however, John Dickinson, where most of the colonies were still thinking of themselves as independent states, he refers to America, right? He's already, the idea of America as a common entity is coming alive. And then the famous Boston Tea Party. I'm not going to go into that in any kind of detail, but the most important element of that really is that it is the British reaction, because the British reaction is what leads to an intensification of the unity of the colonies. It's when they actually decide that, you know, before that, for Virginia, for example, thought the Bostonians were just a bunch of hotheads, right? There was nothing you could do with them. They were totally impolite and, you know, etc. But this case, when they were being under siege by the British with the shutdown of the port of Boston, all of a sudden things changed. And that built colonial unity, helping lead to the First Continental Congress, which all but Georgia attend, and, you know, leads to various anti-importation laws and so forth, many other things. But everything, obviously, in terms of publications and pamphlets really intensifies at this point. This I find particularly interesting. This is a guy from New England also, who writes sermons that are become pamphlets that are circulated widely through the colonies, first after the Gaspé affair, then this Watchman's Alarm. And here he says, you know, we are fighting for the rights of the people, and the power of the people binds the kings in fetters and nobles in iron. In other words, there's a natural law that these authorities in government cannot contravene, or else they're illegitimate. And at the same time, or shortly after that, you have more activity from the more established political leaders in the colonies. John Adams writes these Novanglus letters, and there he elaborates a point that I've seen written very much in current semi-attacks on the American Revolution, which is that we're all conspiracy theorists. We've all been conspiracy theorists from the beginning. And because here he is, you know, John Adams, he said there is a conspiracy. There's a conspiracy that's been going on since 1965 to basically enslave us, take away all our liberties. You know, look at what's going. The tax on tea. They're using this money to pay our governors, judges, which is what previously the local lower houses of the colonies were doing. They're taking away trials by jury. Remember the Admiralty courts being sent to in England for trial. Military government that was already in effect in Massachusetts, and so forth. And at the same time, actually, John Adams is doing that. Alexander Hamilton is writing his first pamphlets as well, but I'm not going to go into that right now. And then shortly after that is when the shooting war begins, April 1775, but already very well having been prepared in the minds of the people. It hasn't turned against the king yet, except to the extent of saying the king has to be ruled in that way. The guy, who lights the spark on the king in particular is Tom Paine. And but unfortunately, for many, he is the beginning and the end, of the ideas that sparked the revolution. And obviously, as you can see, that's not really the case. This is, in America, the law is king. And this ferment at this point becomes more intense against bringing liberty not only to the white free men, but also to act against slavery. And that takes us to the Declaration, which I'm going to do real quick, so we'll have time for discussion. Because this is the end of, because we have to do this because it is the formal statement of the causes of the revolution. Now, my view of the Constitution, of the Declaration is, I flatter myself to think it's Lincoln's view, that the core of it is the statement of principle in the preamble, and that it was seriously intended to say what it says. I like the statement of one of the people who attacked the 1619 Project, one of the historians, say, would you rather agree with Lincoln or would you rather agree with Jefferson Davis? That what this meant was not that all men were created equal. It really meant all white men. And Lincoln said, no, not that they could dictate it, and not that it was the case, but it was a standard maximum for free society that should be familiar to all, constantly looked to, labored for, and approximated to the augmenting the happiness and value of life to all the people of all colors everywhere. And then the causes, right? Now, I'm not including everyone individually, but obviously this reflects the shift to blaming the king. And of course, these Whigs the pamphleteers actually did move to saying that the king was, through corruption, actually involved in these parliamentary atrocities against them. So one class of abuses is refusing assent to laws for the public good. And this included those laws on the slave trade, which were vetoed, many of which happened in the 1770s, laws on land use, laws on immigration, and so forth. And if you look at the itemization, there are, I don't forget how many there are like 15 different abuses that are outlined there. This is obviously a condensation. Supplanting local government and its powers, including laying taxes. In other words, we're not allowed to control our courts or our governors by controlling their salaries. The British government has decided that they're going to do it. And they're using those powers corruptly. And this is one of the examples. Making justice dependent upon the royal will. This is an original courthouse, but that refers in particular to the fact that the British had determined that the justices, the judges, would be paid by the crown. So it's basically having the judge in the same court as the prosecutor. Obviously a matter of some concern and opposition. Stationing a standing army among the people. This you definitely have, saw in New York, you saw in Massachusetts, and many other places. And waging war against us. Note that not only what was going on in Massachusetts, but at least 2 cities had been burned to the ground by the British by this time. One was Norfolk, and the other was Portland, Maine, also at that time known as Falmouth, before the Declaration. The item omitted, of course, was, which Jefferson had included and his committee had approved, was the abuse on slavery per se, that Jefferson said was because some people still thought that they could actually reason with people in Great Britain, but actually it happened because South Carolina and Georgia violently objected. But they did go ahead, and they did come out with the conclusion was the statement of sovereignty going fully to the assembly of the colonies, now states, in the Americas. But this is left an open question. And this is one thing from the Hamilton musical, which I found particularly telling, which was the soliloquy of King George III, who said, okay, so now you're independent. What are you going to do now? Was the revolution complete? The war was about to be on, but it was going to last a long time. What were they going to do next? And that's really, was it going to be a revolutionary change? Or was it going to be a shift simply from one set of established powers to another? And that, my friends, is part 1.